Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? Um, Before I start my presentation, I just want to know among the audience, how many of you are architects or remotely related to architecture, connected to architecture, involved in architecture? Can I see a show of hands? Oh, so great. So that doesn't make me the only black pink sheep in the crowd. I have friends. I just want to, before I start my presentation, I want to give you a brief introduction about myself. My journey started not so long ago as an architect. And while I was studying architecture, I also started writing on architecture, which sort of made me get into words and graphic design and started looking at architecture in a very different way. Writing started helping me critique architecture, which gave me a very funny relationship with architecture that I belong to it, but I take liberties to critique it very freely. And from then on, when I picked up a course in journalism, my mom was so sure that it was a hidden boyfriend and nothing else. But then once I continued with that, and then I went on to do 2 books on architecture, my interest started growing towards graphics and typography. So in a way, I started learning about typography on the field. And when I came back and set up my own practice in Bangalore and I got into teaching, I also started heading the publication division in my college. So the context that I come here with, I would like to have a few clarifications given before I really get on to my presentation. This, what I'm going to present to you, is an interdisciplinary concept. It's a set of observations that I've done standing at the fringe of typography, looking at this whole vast world where architecture and typography meet and how it can get better. So if you're expecting some hardcore funda on typography, you're not going to get it, but you will get a whole different insight to look at typography. Most of the data that is pertinent is already there on the slide, so I'm not going to go through it. You can read it while we're going through. And if you see any font that you hate, please ignore it. It's an architect who's doing it, all right? Having said that, I just want to quickly bring you to the context of this presentation, which is, see, we've been in this auditorium from the past 2 days, and some of us from the past 3 days. This type has been my identity from the past 3 days, okay? So my personal bubble as a person, as an individual, has come from the type, all right? So let's just zoom out a little, okay? Let's take the stage and the podium. You find the board sitting in front, which is the typo day, actually defining and setting the identity of the stage. Now tomorrow, if there is another conference, you'll have another type that sets the identity of the space. Zoom out a little more. Let's come to the building. How many of you noticed the type of this building when you entered it on the first day? Have you seen it? Great. Do you see what it does and how it changes during the day, the way it sits on the surface? Let's zoom out a little more. We had Nanki talk about, Jaipur and the identities at a very urban level. So when we start moving out, type does a lot more than what it is originally intended to. So what I bring to this presentation are basically 3 key aspects. One, type not just as a 2D planar element, but it's a 3D spatial object. What happens when type becomes an object versus just a planar thing? What happens when type not just is a visual experience, but it becomes a tactile entity in a space? What happens when the type, versus being a written expression, becomes a constructed feature, okay? So that's the point which situates my research. These are the 3 points. And so what you will see here is that when you juxtapose the form on a font for a function, there's a whole framework of design identities that start emerging, okay? Now, are these identities mutually inclusive or mutually exclusive, especially in a built environment? Can the type establish its identity independent of its architecture, that is hosting it? Can the built structure be complete without the built word? what is the identity of a typeface in a built word? Okay, so the context is the fineness and the sensitivity with which architecture handles typography. That's how I'm situating myself in this conference. Words traditionally have been the custodians of history and time. While the word celebrated the essence, the type added character. Words came together to build an expression, but what about the built word? So when the font, form, and function came together, there was a whole series of identities that started coming on. Now let's look at font and function. When you look at the ancient temples or the olden temples, you find a lot of inscriptions in them, okay? So architecture there receives font, providing it as a surface for information. When you look at the Times Square in New York, the graphic is more a visual experience. It's just a transient visual depiction, and the architecture there sort of disappears, and the graphics takes over. When you look at Vidhan Sauda in Bangalore, the work philosophy is so permanently etched into the building, where the font in the function of a building reassures the public of transparency and faith. If you look at the Vietnam War Memorial, the font is elevated to the stratum of a very sacred emotional level. The architecture just disappears. It's all about neither the font, nor the function, nor the architecture. It's about the feeling, the essence, okay? What I'm trying to draw your attention to is that when font and function come together in architecture, you have various identities that come up. It comes up as a source of information, depiction, personalizing a philosophy or eternalizing a philosophy, or it could become go to a level of being sacred. No matter what, the font needs a form, even in architecture. Having said that, when we move on to font and form, the next set of identities that we're looking at, this is a classic example which a couple of my co-presenters have also gone through, and it came about even in the quiz, is, see, the column found architectural significance. It was a statement, but in that, you also find the font or the type being nestled. And I don't have to go through it, all of you are probably aware of it. So what happens here is that a type which was meant for manuscript or monuments is then getting digitally transferred into a typeface. On the other hand, you have the bahwas, which was developed in a way that it was meant to be sensitive to move between mediums. Unlike the first one, which was meant primarily for a stone surface carving, here the font understood the mediums that it was expressing, so it migrated very easily between the print and the built mediums. Keeping this in mind, I'm just going to present you a few examples in architecture where the built font is a constructed conscious identity in architecture, which becomes integral to the building identity. Most of these examples are samples of different situations. I have consciously left out the Indian counterparts. I'll come to it later, why that has been done. So this is only a sample of the various possibilities that could happen. So if you generally look at the timeline, I've started with 1925 with the Bahwas building, and then gone on to another 6 more examples. So I'll quickly be running through these 7 examples to see how type becomes a constructed element in architecture. So the first example, like I mentioned earlier, there are data available, you can sort of read it. What is interesting in this is that the fineness, the spirit of the movement came about in the way the font was designed, and that was then extrapolated to a very public scale in this building, wherein the fineness of the way each letter was crafted and the way it sat on the building made a difference to the identity of the building. So here, if you notice, the way the light plays a role on the font for the form of the architecture is also important. So there was the sensitivity which was showed was that even in the shadows, there's no distortion. The essence of the font is maintained. And it is adding a dimension to the building that although the building is very following a set of principles of modernism, the playfulness is actually brought in by the font. And the fact that each of these letters were made in the workshops of the building added that much more relevance to it. It made it belong more. So it just didn't become an identity giver, it was also a visual layer. So the second situation is when the font and the form, in which the font becomes a branding in architecture. So when we go on to the Odeon cinema houses in UK, the building was still following the modernistic principles, and they looked at the font to add in the larger-than-life playfulness to it. So if you see, at this point of time, the entertainment industry and the aspect of people finding time after work grew. So suddenly people had a whole chunk of time which they said, we need pleasure at this point of time. We have done our job and we need to be hyper-stimulated. We need something exotic. So this is when the stadiums, the theaters, the casinos and all that started. And then the font became the stimulating experience for the building. So the building was still pure, the architecture was still pure, but the font rendered what the building just couldn't do, which was hyper-stimulating the users. And moving on, we have the classic example of Las Vegas, which is the ultimate branding experience that you can give. And then, of course, we have the Ginza shopping district in Tokyo, which is like a neon forest in an urban life, which sort of takes your font and architecture to a completely different level, where you really have to say, where the hell is architecture? Where the hell is life even in this? Moving on, font and form as an interpretation of pragmatics. Now, going back to basics, every building needs structure, it needs a column, it needs beams, it needs something to hold it up. But what if this pragmatic requirement of a building got translated into a font? And that is what happens here in the minaret building, where if you notice the structure which holds up the building is actually a font. So what it gives is it apart from giving a visual layering, which is the identity of the building, it is also being functional. And the other thing that happens here is that Notre Dame, the Netherlands as such, propagates use of cycles a lot as a mode of transportation. And the fact that the font sits near the cycle stand makes it a cultural marker as well. And it also adds a very playful anthropometric sculptural expression to the building. This is actually in Hungary. And what happens here is that this building was the police headquarters during the Nazi and the communist period. So here, if you can see, the font is actually the shadow that is cast on the building when the sun moves. Okay, so the way the type has got interpreted is that there is the stoic building which represented the oppression that people went through during the Nazi period. So when this was to be converted into a museum wherein you have to express the brutality that people went through, the building stops saying anything. It's very closed, you don't see any windows, it's absolutely a dungeon sort of a thing. And then you have the font, in which it's an awning on which terror is sort of inscribed. And as the sun moves, the length of the shadow starts increasing. So at one point of time, the font is super big with terror almost taking over the entire building. But there is one point of time when the sun comes right above the building and the shadow is cast in a way that the terror disappears. So it's a very symbolic way that type is getting used here, that so it becomes figurative in a way. In this example, this is the Wales Millennium Center. And what you see here is the main auditorium of the center, which has a copper oxide coated stainless steel dome, forming the identity of the building. Now, most of the times, just like any designer here would agree, that as architects, we articulate through words, through sketches, through interviews. But what happens if my design philosophy is permanently engraved on the building? Now, this is different from the work philosophy that we saw in Vedant Sauda. This is a design philosophy that the architect is wanting you to understand. And here, the font, the type, almost pauses you at the entrance and then says, look at me, this is what I'm doing in the building. And what is nice about this is the way it very tactfully integrates itself into the interiors as well. Now, this is the bar behind on the upper level of the auditorium. So the font is actually a fenestration on my wall, which forms the backdrop to my bar. And at night, you have a spectacle, which is read in a different way. So again here, the next example wherein we are trying to see the font and form as an extensional skin. So here what happens is that in Phoenix, Arizona, this was a public library which was built with a lot of budget constraint. You don't see the building here, but the little door and the light behind that is the building. So this building was a very utilitarian building, not a very high budget building. But then it needed a civicness to project because it was a public library, it had a public scale, it had a civic function that it had to cater to. And what the architect has done in this is that you have these steel strips which is mounted on eye sections, and the font is actually expressed in the reflective tape between the two steel strips. So when the light falls on it, it's the reflection on it which gives away the font. But what it did, it gave a public scale to the building. It gave a civicness to the building, which the actual library behind was much more humble and sort of covered. The last example that I'm presenting today is the very famous Cooper Square in New York. Now, the Cooper building itself stands for free education, accessibility. Why should education be charged? So it stands for a design philosophy. And here the architect has tried to experiment with the building itself as a blob. He tries to push the shape to the extent to which says, can it free the mind? Can it be a symbol of free mind itself? And at this point, I would like to also mention that the year 2009 or after 2005 onwards, you see a lot of architects consciously shifting to experimenting with forms. So words like bend, twist, extrude have become actually the starting points in form finding for architecture itself. So when you actually look at the building, the architect has worked very closely with the type designer. And the type comes across at three critical junctures. So this is also quite important as to where the type was introduced in the building. So if you see here, when you see the building on the front, the name of the building, that is the Cooper Union, is perfectly fine as an elevation. But the minute you go closer, you see that the type is extruded, carved, there is a transparency that you see. So as you're walking under the building, there's actually no surface that is defining it. It's the negative that defines it. And you realize that it is sort of getting bent along the surface. The second place where the font or the type reappears is under the atrium lobby. This building was primarily built on donors' money. So they had to acknowledge a huge list of donors who really made this happen. So if you see, it is very tactfully put under the staircase. And the third place where it comes is in the donor room. So the donors, there were specific people who funded the rooms. So when you see from the front, when you're actually walking through the corridor, it acts as a graphic. But when you really come close, the frame of the door is where the names are etched. So if you actually see the font when it sits along with forms and function, getting you an identity, you find various conditions that happen. Sometimes it becomes a part of the building as a visual layer, but at all times, it's still the architecture that dominates the font. The font is subservient to the building. So having studied these 7 examples, I mean, the examples are much more, but for the sake of the time and the limitations of the presentation, I've given you a sample of these 7. Architecture has never been the word keeper. It's always history. But then people have used architecture for various reasons, in the sense that architecture offered a sense of permanence, as you saw in terms of the inscription. So that is where the architecture started translating into being a word keeper. But like I said before, the word got built quite literally here. So when you start looking and analyzing these examples, you realize that the sensitivity with which the type was handled in architecture is primarily a reflection of the society's preference. The second thing was the material culture of the region. And the third thing was the technological advancement at that time period. These were the 3 main factors that sort of led to the fineness or the sensitivity with which the font got handled in architecture. So if you go through the 7 examples, you start realizing that what was once a 2-dimensional layer, by the time you come to the Cooper square, it starts becoming there's a 3-dimensionality that gets added to it, and it starts transforming as an object and not really as a 2-dimensional layer. So it starts becoming multi-layered in its intent, and it starts engaging into the space as a craft, modulating it with its own subtlety and fineness. And it coexists with architecture, but still the identity is not stated. It's there, but it's still not there, kind of a situation. So if you look at typography and architecture, and you look at the overlaps that I sort of brought your attention in the beginning, you find the 7 situations for which I gave you examples as the conditions when font and form come together, and the earlier set of examples when we were looking at form and function. So when you look at the profession of typography and architecture, there are a lot of overlaps. We all talk the same language in a way that both the professions are being design-based, they're user-driven, experience-centric, visual elements matter, legibility matters, whether be it space or type. But then there are obvious gaps as well, wherein the conjunction of typography and architecture most of the times is it's just incidental. It's not a conscious correlation that happens, not often. Architecture as a field is quite egoistic. And it sort of fails to acknowledge a lot of design forces that can add value to it. And type is usually seen as a necessity than a value add. And when architects don't sort of see it as a complete design package, the perception of font becomes subordinate to the form. So, like I said, the typography and architecture can have a lot of generic overlaps, but then there are blatant gaps as well. When you start seeing that the kind of tricks and techniques that the buildings are trying to do, which is fold, bend, warp, distort, extend, this is sort of getting transferred onto its type as well. So what I feel is that there needs to be a framework that needs to be developed, through which architects and type designers can work together to make this a more conscious construct rather than a coincidental happening. And my further areas of research that I've identified is quite a bit. And in this also comes typography and Indian architecture. Now, you just saw over the last 2 days a lot of people touching upon various phases of Indian architecture. So it's not as simple as it looks. So there's a lot of layering that one needs to do. And then there is environmental typography in Indian architecture. Again, the dual roles of vernacular and English in architecture again. Critical regionalism, Indian versus Asian, identity of cities. Now this is again another aspect that I'm hoping to touch into, is that what Helvetica is to New York, all the subway stations being in Helvetica. And there are type emerging out in Chandigarh as well, could there be types that we can associate with cities? And then also typography in interior design. Now this is again another aspect that has come about from my personal experience as an interior designer, is that we do get clients who come to us and say, can my branding come onto the table as well when I do the cafe? Or can you put it onto the furniture as well? So till what extent can type play a role? And how can you situate it in a building? Now the last aspect I think is something that I want to spend a couple of minutes on it. What are the fonts that can adapt themselves to architecture? Now this is a question that I want to open it out to you guys as a takeaway from this presentation, apart from all that you've got, is that could it be that as designers, can we add on another layer of information that when you're designing something, could you also see what if this gets a three-dimensionality? Now most of the type designs look at it as a 2D element. Now, could you prescribe some fonts to architects and say, you can use this as a 3D construct in your buildings? Could we add more layers of, say, the light and shadow, the role of materials? The memory of the hand is excellent. All of us need the hand. The discipline that the hand gets, and by drawing and writing over and over, it develops a language of its own. All my due respects to it. Can we expand the outlook towards typography a little more and say, and make other professions also more inclusive to it, so that if somebody wants to do a certain kind of typography in their building, they could use this font. All right, so it can still primarily be a 2D, two-dimensional aspect, but then there is a three-dimensional aspect to it too. Like all you typographers, we as architects also have our own fonts, which we like. And what are they? And why are they more appealing to architects than the others? That's again another area. And architectural philosophy. So when I was doing the books, I realized that when I showed the sample of my books to my co-architects, each one had a very different way of reading the book and a different expression to the font. Some said, no, I don't think this sort of suits the contemporary architecture in Bangalore. By the way, that was the book I wrote on. I wrote on 40 architectural buildings that represent the contemporary architecture in Bangalore. So they said, no, this is not contemporary. Then there was another set of architects which sort of vouched for the same type and said, no, this is what contemporary is. So the whole psychology of how architects look at type and find their own opinion is also quite interesting. So that's where I am. All I'm trying to majorly raise sort of two concerns. One, could type become a 3D constructed object? Second, even when we saw how we were talking about training the hand to do calligraphy, could font be taught to students in a very different way? Like what if the fonts could be built in schools in a way that they can actually feel the font as a three-dimensional space? Would that register better in them? And would they learn the font a lot more better if it's like that? Okay, so that's about it. And from IIT Mumbai, I go back to Nama Bengaluru with a very wonderful experience. So the challenge was that if I can survive 48 hours of typography, I can really do this research. Thank you so much.
Sir, thank you, Professor. Being an architect, typographer, and